So I'm just going to relieve the pressure of trying to solve world peace in one sermon. I'm just going to let that go. Though I cannot promise, we'll get to the hope of children later. I cannot promise to solve world peace in a single sermon. I can promise we'll go on a journey together. First, we'll examine a Unitarian Universalist ethical approach to peacemaking. I'll propose a relationship to that ethic. We will take a trip together in our minds to a museum. We'll learn about a game, and finally, we'll not forget to include the poet's perspective on the quality of peace, what it could feel like. Are you ready? Yes. I said, are you ready? Yes. All right. Our Unitarian Universalist denomination undergoes a process every few years called the Study Action Issue, SAI. Here is my 2-minute skeptic analysis of our study action issues, which is a well-intentioned process to train our collective eye towards a single large-scale justice issue. We, as a denomination, often spend 2 to 4 years studying this issue, this single issue. Some congregations are aware of this, and they'll join a common book study. Other congregations remain unaware. After a few years, a resolution is passed, a circle of General Assembly and denominational enthusiasts participate, and slowly, word trickles outward towards congregations, most of whom take very little immediate action. My greatest critique of this process is that the issue, while somewhat widely discussed and considered, quickly becomes a missed theological opportunity for Unitarian Universalist orthodoxy. Now, before you shout me down or run me out with pitchforks, or someone earlier had knitting needles, keep in mind the definition of orthodoxy is merely authorized or generally accepted theory, doctrine, or practice. That's all. Authorized or generally accepted theory, doctrine, or practice. And here I'm mostly speaking of practice. Did you know peacemaking was our study action issue from 2006 to 2010? Me neither. None of us did. The study action issue of peacemaking was framed in this way. Should the Unitarian Universalist Association reject the use of any and all kinds of violence and war to resolve disputes between peoples and nations, and adopt a principle of seeking just peace through nonviolent means? That was how they framed it. The Study Action Issues accompanying resource guide offers a list of possible study questions, and the first 2 of these questions reframe the central question in terms of just war, meaning justified war, and pacifist traditions. Should we, the Unitarian Universalist Association and member congregations, adopt a specific and detailed just war or justified war policy to guide our witness, advocacy, and social justice efforts? Or should we, the Unitarian Universalist Association and member congregations, reject violence in any form? So those were 2 of the questions put forth. In his 2009 paper, so 2009 is right towards the end of this study action issue, in the Journal of Liberal Religion, titled Beyond Just War and Pacifism, UU theologian Paul Razor makes a case for the adoption of a third stance, a theological ethical stance he calls prophetic nonviolence. He suggests, as a religion, we have historically taken a just war stance, and while welcoming pacifists on an individual basis. If you are wondering about all of these terms, just war, which meaning justified war, pacifism, and prophetic nonviolence, I'll return to those in just a minute. In recent years, in my opinion, peacemaking has fallen out of fashion. Growing up in the 1980s, under the shadow of the Cold War in Chicago, in my memory, peace was on everyone's lips. I remember the massive protests against the first Iraq War in downtown Chicago, hoisted up on my dad's shoulders so I could see the crowd stretching into the tens of thousands. Do you remember those protests around 1990? This was no fringe peace effort. I remember packed out forums at Third Unitarian Universalist Church of Chicago on nuclear disarmament that felt relevant and fresh. I remember peace is possible bumper stickers and peace sign earrings and peace dove buttons. I remember visiting the Peace Museum often with my family. Now, if you've never heard of the Peace Museum, our country's only museum of peace that sadly closed its doors in 2007, I encourage you to look it up on the internet. Founded in 1981 by the muralist Mark Rogovin, the museum opened with a stunning exhibition of drawings by survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings called The Unforgettable Fire, drawing the attention of U2's Bono, who named their next record after that exhibition, The Unforgettable Fire. As a child, I remember Saturday trips to the small museum to see John Lennon's guitar on display, or the exhibit of the full body of work of cartoonist Gary Trudeau. I remember making paper cranes to hang from the ceiling in honor of Sadako Sasaki, a precocious young girl who was born in Hiroshima and died of cancer at age 12 due to her close proximity to the bomb. Most of all, I remember the final station of the museum before you get to the exit, called Letters to the President. I wrote countless letters to President Reagan in that room, imploring him in purple crayon to disarm, to end all wars, to become an international leader for peace. I was 8 years old. Then came the rise of Clinton-era neoliberalism, Bush-era neoconservatism, and post-9/11 nationalism, then Obama's endorsement of just war theory, and nowadays, we don't talk about peace as much anymore. In 2010, at our UU General Assembly, the UUA adopted a statement of conscience. We believe all people share a moral responsibility to create peace. Mindful of both our rich heritage and our past failures to prevent war, and enriched by our present diversity of experience and perspective, we commit ourselves to a radically inclusive and transformative approach to peace. There are many points that followed, but here's just one. We advocate a culture of peace through a transformation of public policies, religious consciousness, and individual lifestyles. At the heart of this transformation is the readiness to honor the truths of multiple voices from a theology of covenant grounded in love. Now, I understand our lack of doctrine maintains a commitment to honoring multiple truths. However, I wonder how well a statement of conscience on peace that allows for war is serving us. Make no mistake, I'm not saying all UUs should be barred from deciding to take up arms in defense against a despot, if that's how they are called. However, I do believe we should have a branch of Unitarian Universalists who are committed to a life of what Paul Reiser calls prophetic nonviolence. This does not mean that all UUs must commit to this life choice, but it will be an ethic by which the rest of us measure our own moral position. What is prophetic nonviolence, and how does it work in relationship to just war theory and pacifism? Paul Reiser, this UU theologian, says to move beyond just war and beyond pacifism is not to abandon either tradition. It is rather to recognize that both perform important roles in our ongoing efforts to reduce the violence of war. Reiser wants us to maintain our affirmation of peace as a core value while continuing to stay engaged in the world and not apart from it, as some believe pacifism might have us do. Just war theory, when applied, filters through the moral checklist of just cause, justified cause, right intention, probability of success, legitimate authority, and last resort. Barack Obama popularized justified war theory, ironically, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. When applied to a Unitarian Universalist religious stance, this ideology becomes problematic. Christian ethicists Stanley Hauerwas, Linda Hogan, and Enda McDonough point to this problem by asking whether the just war tradition might itself be part of the historical narrative that legitimizes and perpetuates the logic of war. The stories we tell about ourselves and our histories include positive accounts of war, and over time these stories become self-legitimizing. War comes to be seen as normal and rational. By the same token, because the just war tradition has long used rational analysis to make moral judgments about war, it too becomes part of this historical narrative, and so unwittingly functions as part of the logic of war. If this assessment is right, this ethical assessment is right, it would suggest that the just war model cannot reduce the violence of war in the long run. Because it argues, instead, this philosophy argues that the just war tradition inevitably undermines its own effectiveness simply by treating war as a rational human enterprise. And then we have pacifism, which is a philosophical or religious stance of opposition to war. Now, the word pacifism did not actually appear until the early 20th century. Previously, non-resistance was the term used by most Christian pacifists to describe what we would now call pacifism. UU theologian Paul Razor reminds us just war and pacifism are concerned with the limits of loyalty to the state. This is more obvious in pacifism, especially religious forms of pacifism, which often frame their responses to the government's war efforts in terms of a higher loyalty to God. Ethicist Joseph Fahey makes the important point that today's nation-states presume that young men and women are willing to kill other young men and women for their flag. This presumption is reflected in our national policies towards conscientious objection, among other things. Killing is considered the norm, and a person must make a case for not killing. By incorporating the counter-assumption in both the pacifist and the just war traditions, prophetic nonviolence takes a principled stand against the official presumption that young people must be prepared to kill at the behest of the state. Christian theologian and contemporary mystic Richard Rohr also uses this term prophetic nonviolence as the religious response to war. Now is a good time to reflect, he says, on our public lives as active peacemakers, to investigate the quality of our loving kindness and peaceableness behind our activism, as well as the boldness of our work. We need to be prophets of nonviolence. That is, we need to speak out publicly and lend our voice to the grassroots movement calling for an end to war, racism, nuclear weapons, poverty, corporate greed, and environmental destruction, and for a new culture of peace and nonviolence. UU Paul Razor closes his essay by saying, and I agree here, we need to be as clear and theologically grounded as possible. Progressive Christian theologian Walter Wink puts this in blunt terms. What the church needs most desperately is precisely a clear-cut, unambiguous position. If we are going to adopt prophetic nonviolence as a denomination, then, which is at once a convergence and an exclusion of aspects of both just war theory and pacifism, well, we can still make room for other positions. We can honor the service of military families and veterans and provide pastoral care and welcoming ministries to them, even as our UU ethicists maintain a stance of prophetic nonviolence. Similar to our theological position, we may have individuals in our midst who practice pacifism and others who hold a just war approach, and all can be welcome in our midst. However, much like Jews who do not keep kosher or Christians who choose not to fast for Lent, they will be part of a clearly understood spectrum of orthodoxy. There's that word again, generally accepted practice. What I'm saying is that I would like to see a branch of Unitarian Universalists who practice prophetic nonviolence. We can observe their practice. We can learn through their modeling. Just like the Jews who do not keep kosher, they still take care to make sure a kosher kitchen is available for those who are most orthodox in their practice. And I would like for those of us who feel called to prophetic nonviolence to begin their holy practice today and proclaim a Unitarian Universalist stance against U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, where polarization has reigned for many decades. Can I get an amen to that? Amen. May those early adopters of prophetic nonviolence call upon our allies and our government to instead support negotiations between the Venezuelan government and its opponents that could allow the country to finally emerge from its crisis for the sake of the Venezuelan people, for the region, and for the principle of national sovereignty. The opportunities for prophetic nonviolence are plentiful. They are multitude. Our video clip from earlier gave us a brief overview of the World Peace Game, developed by a Virginia public elementary school teacher named John Hunter. If you have a spare 15 minutes this week, I invite you to watch one of the most inspiring TED Talks of our time. In fact, it is one of the top 10 TED Talks ever watched. Just Google World Peace Game TED Talk. John Hunter, the soft-spoken public school teacher, created a world peace simulation played by fourth graders over a period of 8 weeks where they have to solve 50 interlocking world crises, and they represent different nations. The game includes various levels. Did you see that? There was the bottom level, then there was the level above, and then the level above that. And the levels include space and a weather goddess who causes chaos, as well as a secret saboteur who acts like a player but is actually undermining various players' goals. No one can win until all nations have progressed economically. Every country's asset value, rich or poor, has to be increased above its starting point in order to win, for anyone to win. The goal of the game is to extricate each country from dangerous circumstances and achieve global prosperity with the least amount of military intervention. And these fourth graders, they win the game. They can figure it out. They use G.I. Joe figurines on a 3-dimensional board to play, but one rule of the game, developed by John Hunter, is that every time they lose a figure to a battle, it is replaced by a letter. So the military commander, the child who made the choice to go into battle, has to leave the game for a minute, sit down and write out an individual letter to that soldier's parents and family, explaining what happened and expressing condolences. Then they have to read the letter out loud in front of the entire class. One day, a parent was visiting the classroom, just observing, sitting in the back, and a child did have to write a letter for a soldier he had lost in battle. Another classmate suggested the mom should read the letter out loud because it would sound realer. She read the first sentence, and she read the second sentence, and by the third sentence, she was crying. The teacher, John Hunter, was in tears as well. Some of the children were crying. From the embodied learning experience of their classroom, these kids were learning the cost of war. They explored just war theory from inside of conflict, and they developed innovative and realistic conflict resolution skills. Most of all, they were developing a sense of their own morality and creatively strategizing to do the most good with a clear-eyed understanding of the work and sacrifice it takes to do it. They were becoming ethicists. I suppose I am ready for Unitarian Universalism to declare theological allegiance to something like this combined word of wild peace that the poet, as described by the poet UUCA Amichai, wild peace, takes the two words and combines them. He's an Israeli Nobel Prize-winning poet, a 3-time war veteran who immigrated to Palestine and died in Jerusalem in the year 2000. He writes of wild peace, not the peace of a ceasefire, not even the vision of the wolf and the lamb, but rather, as in the heart when the excitement is over and you can only talk about a great weariness. I know that I know how to kill. That makes me an adult. A peace without the big noise of beating swords into plowshares, without words, without the thud of the heavy rubber stamp. Let it be light, floating, like lazy white foam. A little rest for the wounds. Who speaks of healing? And the howl of the orphans is passed from one generation to the next as in a relay race. The baton never falls. Let it come like wildflowers, suddenly, because the field must have it. Wild peace. To build his criteria for prophetic nonviolence, UU Paul Razor points us to a theological framework of unity. We affirm the basic unity of all existence. Beneath our individuality and our enormous diversity lies a profound relationality, an interdependent web that connects us. This unity helps us envision a world in which there is no other to war against. May it be so. Amen.